I'm John Atack. This is my guest, Richard Turner. Is that right? Have I got your name right? Was it a good start, isn't it? And you belong to a dangerous authoritarian cult group. You left that. You are now a counsellor helping people who are recovering from that sort of experience. And you took the master's degree in coercive control at Salford University with Rod and Linda Marshall. And so that gives some vague shape. You came to me because you were diagnosed on the autistic spectrum, which I should think was tremendously helpful in understanding what was happening in your world. I'm fascinated by, I have the kind of systematizing aspect of Asperger's. One of my brothers tells me that he color codes his socks so they'll never get lonely. They'll always stay in pairs and be. There's 6 pairs of black socks. These ones are the red dot. These ones are the yellow dot. What have you? And that was one of the things that first made me aware that as well as reading Simon Baron-Cohen, that we all are somewhere or other on the spectrum. You came to me with the idea that it may be that people on the spectrum are more vulnerable to recruitment. So why don't you kick off with some of that? Tell me something about that.
So with my, just to give a bit of a background as well, my autism diagnosis came after being in the cult group, and it was part of my asking questions about what happened to me, why am I the way why am I the way I am, and reflecting on it. I suppose the cult experience kind of made me reassess everything in my whole life. So my autism diagnosis has been part of the healing process for me as well. Because as you might be aware, part of the control in a cult group is that people think that they're the problem. It's not the group. There's guilt and shame, and that guilt and shame is part of the control mechanisms. And actually getting the diagnosis helped me think, there are things about me and it's not my fault. I was wired certain ways, I act certain ways, I've got vulnerabilities and this isn't my fault. And it was very, very healing. But in terms of cult groups, to begin with, my view of autism is that, and there's a phrase that floats around in the autistic community that I hear quite a bit, is if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Everybody is so unique. There are similarities in traits, and people have them in a little bit of a different way. I don't have some traits as strong, as noticeable as other autistic people, but there are certain things about me which other autistic people might not have as much. So very briefly, an overview of my autism is incredibly fixated, obsessive interests. I have sensory processing problems, which means I have to wear tinted glasses if I'm in front of a computer. This computer now has got a dim screen because I'm so sensitive to light. I touch, tastes, things like that. Very, very sensitive to those things. I struggle with social interaction with people. Now, what I find is small talk is very difficult. Like, I don't know what people are expecting of me when they're talking to me. I have learned over the years scripts. If someone says, "How are you?" I go, "I'm okay. How are you?" And it's a script out of my head. It's not a natural response often. So I find that anything social is quite challenging. I can't get very good eye contact, which you can't tell on here, because fortunately, what online interactions mean is that it's much easier for me to engage actually than in real life. So especially in a social way, you wouldn't get much eye contact from me if we were face to face. And that's very, very brief. With autism, you struggle with social things, sensory processing things, fixed routines. But with that as well, there's also a lot of anxiety. Things feel like out of control with me. If they seem like it's vague, I often don't understand like vagueness, or if the routine isn't compartmentalized in boxes, I get very anxious. So, that's a very brief overview of my autism, because I could talk about that for 2 hours straight easily, but I didn't want to dominate the video with that. But in terms of the cult experience, you know, it's very common for people, especially with undiagnosed autism, to get bullied a lot in school, not fit in, feel like there's something wrong with them, really struggle with self-esteem and things like that. So to begin with, you know, as you're well aware, it's quite understandable that love bombing is very effective for somebody on the spectrum, because having a lifetime of feel like you don't fit in and all of a sudden you feel like you do, it's massive. To the point where in the group I was in, when I remember now distinctly just being in tears because of the love bombing, because you're so great, you're doing so good, we're so great to have you on, it's grateful to have you on board, we can see great things for your future. And in coming from being in high school where I didn't even want to go into the canteen to eat because I didn't like being around people, and I hid in the music practice room, and then I started going home, and I was frightened of going in every day, and it's just really low self-esteem. And all of a sudden these people just full on telling you the great things about yourself, and that was a big thing to begin with. And that's one of the things that made me defend them and kind of almost made me suppress those gut feelings that you often get when you meet a cult member where you think something doesn't feel right here, because they were being so nice. Now, obviously, lots of people, generally speaking, go through similar experiences, but I sensed that the struggles I had prior to being involved in a cult group, it made me a little bit more vulnerable in that area. So the other challenging thing, I think, as well, is I tend to find that I trust people, take people at face value, and see almost, you know, people with Asperger's, how you want to pronounce that, tend to be very honest and struggle to understand that other people aren't honest. Now, again, that doesn't apply to every autistic person, but it's a common trait. And I found that people have said to me, "Richard, you're so honest. You're too honest. People don't know how to take you sometimes." And I, as I've reflected on my experience in linking with the cult, I started to wonder, was I projecting that honesty onto other people, and I assumed everybody else was honest, and there was no deception? I know you've mentioned deception in one of your recent videos as well. Not realising that there were other motives, not realising that actually this is about getting me involved and then coercing me to become more committed and take a lot of my money, was a big thing. So that was another vulnerability I picked up in myself. What's quite helpful for me in life is when things are really clear. And I tend to find I have a natural tendency for black and white thinking anyway. I like things to be rigid and clear. I actually get anxious quite a lot if things feel like vague and confusing. And to protect myself, try and make things really clear. So what I've done is studying a lot of psychology that has helped me understand relationships, understand people, things that are often a bit abstract. But the problem is in cult groups, as you're quite familiar with, I'm sure, things are clear. You know, here's the rules, here's what you need to follow, here's what you need to do. And that actually, I sense, probably made me more vulnerable as well. I remember the exact moment being around people and the control started to kick in. Like, you must learn to submit to the leadership was the common phrase. And I remember actually feeling warmth from it and like peace from the control in the early days until it started costing me something, really costing me something. But I remember feeling it was amazing how much attention I got. I remember feeling, actually, this maybe isn't so bad, this bit of control, because I feel safe. I feel like I get where I am. So there was a few things really, and also I suspect one of the challenges in, you know, some of my experiences prior to that is struggling to stand up for myself, struggling to speak out. I had an assessment by an educational psychologist when around the time I got diagnosed with autism, and he said that the processing speed of my brain was quite slow, which means I can't think very quick on my feet. Now, as you know, cults want quick decisions. In the moment, they want you know, you're backed into the corner, everything's very quick. Someone does something and it takes a long time to think, something wasn't right then. It happened so quick, I'd just go along with it. I very often will go along with something and not realise what is actually happening until much later, because I can't think quick enough. So in day-to-day life, you know, when I was studying, tutors can't ask me questions in lessons because I need to take a week thinking about it, because I can't think very quick on my feet at all. And I feel that also made me quite vulnerable, because everything happens so quick. People will push boundaries, they'll ask invasive questions, and there was a tendency to answer, you know, straight away without thinking, why are they asking me that? But also because of the low self-esteem, and as a coping mechanism, learning to be quiet, learning to survive as well alongside that submissiveness because of the environment I've been in at high school. Together, those two things again made me very vulnerable, I think, to recruitment.
The most precious and personal part of every person is his or her own mind. No one else ever sees it or knows exactly what it is thinking or feeling. It is our most sacred possession because it houses our innermost identity. It defines for us precisely who we are and who we are not. We can hide the truth from others, but not from ourselves. Or we may think. But our mind, like our body, needs nourishment. Other people feed our mind with thoughts, suggestions, comments, and ideas. We choose which ones to accept and which ones to reject. And we feel confident that we are good at doing so. But are we? To be good at protecting our minds, we must be familiar with the tactics and strategies that may be used by others to outmaneuver our natural protections and defenses. You can see a punch coming, but not a carefully crafted lie or manipulation strategy, unless you are trained to look. Facts are hidden or distorted, and we are rushed into decisions that take away our own authority and harm our interests. Predators cause upset, conflict, corruption, and devastation. By seeing through their methods, we can take power away from human predators and have a much greater chance to overcome the problems they cause in our personal and group relationships. Here is a quick description of the human predator. Human predators are mean, are utterly selfish, pretend friendship and love, but feel absolutely nothing for others. Predators are without conscience. They do not feel remorse or guilt, often boast about the harm they've done other people, are parasites and lazy, living off others, giving as little as possible in return, are control freaks, stopping others from taking control of anything if they can, force petty rules on others, rules that are impossible to follow, boast about tricking other people and breaking the law.
Excited to have John Atack back on board. Hi, John. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Chris. Always good to see you. Because the first thing that we grab hold of is social psychology. The first thing that we look at is, you know, Solomon Asch, Sharif, through Zimbardo, Milgram, what have you. These guys and what they did. And then we look at things also through the lens of clinical psychology and, you know, how you counsel people, how you help people, the best ways to do that. And this is kind of missing from their world. That they
Really?
they're teaching people about, they're not missing the clinical part in that they are counseling people, and they use motivational interviewing techniques and this sort of thing. But for me, the first thing if I can teach anybody anything, is to teach them about group identity, which they understand very well, but then to get into the mechanisms that are used to change somebody's thinking, thought reform.
Right.
Let's not get into the word brainwashing here. Thought reform.
No, I prefer thought reform, undue influence. I mean, the Lifton's territory is more stable ground.
The greatest threat to the autonomy of our mind is from people who seek to influence it from their own best interests, but present themselves as our friends and helpers. Every one of us has great confidence in our ability to protect ourselves from other people, acting in ways that would harm our own best interests. We have faith that we have a strong mind, have good crap detectors, and are not easily influenced. I call this the myth of the unmalleable mind. As kids are fond of saying, "Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me." But they can.
Okay, I said I was not going to get into it. Let's get into it. The word brainwashing was introduced to the English language by a man called Edward Hunter, publicly known as a journalist and the author of Brainwashing, and privately known as a member of a group called the Central Intelligence Agency. And so the hypothesis of brainwashing was introduced to the world as a critique of Chinese communism coming out of the CIA. So you've already got a little bit of a problem, that there might be a little bit of, opposition going on there.
And not to be overly paranoid, but with good reason, because these are the same folks who carried out, and this is a factual thing, there's no conspiracy theory to this whatsoever, these are the folks who later carried out MKUltra and conducted experiments on the public without the public's knowledge.
Yeah, and they're MK Naomi, the Operation Bluebird, which was US Navy intelligence, was the first of them. That was already functioning before the Korean War in 1949, I think. So yes, you've got a group that is doing these very interesting things.
Annie Jacobson is an investigative journalist and author who writes about war, weapons, U.S. national security, and government secrecy. From 2009 to 2013, she served as a contributing editor for the Los Angeles Times Magazine. She is the author of the New York Times bestseller Operation Paperclip, Area 51, and most recently, The Pentagon's Brain, an uncensored history of Darpa, America's top-secret military research agency. Please join me in welcoming Annie Jacobson for a conversation about the past, present, and future of Darpa, the Defense Department's secretive military research agency. Thank you for joining us, Annie.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to begin by discussing the mission of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA. DARPA is credited with creating the internet, GPS, aspects of virtual reality, not to mention a mind-boggling number of acronyms. It is an agency that makes science fiction come to life, or as you describe it, the agency that makes the future happen. For much of its history, this was done in secret, but more and more that is happening now in the open. Talk to us a little bit about in what ways, how, and by whom our destiny and the destiny of future generations is being decided now.
Well, first things first, as an introduction to DARPA, consider this. It's the most powerful, most productive military science agency in the world. And it's also one of the least reported on. So it puts you in a position of saying, well, what has been going on at DARPA, and what does that mean for the future? And another thing I think that's important to consider, as you look at DARPA, they have a press office, sometimes I call it the DARPA advertising agency. They put certain ideas out there about what DARPA is doing, and they're usually kind of gung-ho ideas. DARPA does many great things. It, of course, created the internet, originally called the ARPANET. Because of DARPA, we have GPS technology, sensor technology. But DARPA's mandate, as was instructed to Congress when DARPA was created in 1958, is to create vast weapon systems of the future. That's the quote. And when I found that quote, I thought, I must always keep that in mind when I'm researching and reporting on DARPA, because that is its job. So everything is about military technology. Everything that it works on is, how does this support national security? And that is, of course, a double-edged sword, because that which keeps you safe can also harm you.
So with these directions that DARPA has taken, and some of there's been trajectories over decades. Again, going back to another example out of the Vietnam War, was the idea of trying to apply behavioral science or some social science to understand, or seemingly to try to understand the Viet Cong and what was motivating, what was driving them. But in some cases, it's taken the Pentagon years to appreciate what DARPA has concluded or what they suggested. What happened in that case with the Viet Cong?
Well, I was really surprised, like you're referring to learn that there were anthropologists hired by DARPA in the war, and that came, and again, there's a parallel here with the Iraq War, so I think it's very interesting to consider, because the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, at the time, was stuck on this question. He actually had the equivalent, the 1960s version of a Post-it note in his office that said, what made the Vietnam tick? He wanted to know why these Viet Cong fighters were siding with the communists and not siding with the Americans. And so DARPA set about this sprawling program where it hired anthropologists and social scientists to go into the field, to conduct interviews, to try and find out what made the Viet Cong tick. And I write at length, and I interviewed the lead on that, a man named Joseph Zasloff. And part of why he felt what he told me was so important, because this was a colossal failure. I mean, the Hearts and Minds campaign failed. And Zasloff said that he felt that, when he saw this same thing going on in the Iraq War, because, again, DARPA got this idea, almost like it had amnesia, that DARPA had done this during the Vietnam War, got this brilliant idea during the War on Terror, hey, let's start a Hearts and Minds campaign and figure out what makes the Iraqis tick. And it was the same story over again, and that same failure. So the idea is DARPA is investing all this time and treasure, and one would hope that one would at least get experience and be able to say, well, this doesn't work, how do we need to adjust? And instead, it's astonishing to see that same, instead of amnesia, instead of experience, you get amnesia. And it was no louder spoken to me when I read the Army issued a statement when it kicked this program into effect in Iraq. It was called the Human Terrain Program. And on their website, the Army wrote, this is the first time in history that anthropologists and social scientists are being sent into the war theater on a large scale. But no, it wasn't.
With the shift in influence, and it's interesting talking about trying to find the trust molecule, with the evolution of the influence of DARPA and who is influencing DARPA, is this an agency that the American public can trust? On one hand, we've gotten this narrative from DARPA again and again about what it has essentially given the world. Again, the example of the internet or GPS to make sure that we're not getting lost on our way to tonight's talk. Is with those beneficial those benefits aside, is this an agency you feel like that we can trust?
you know, the journalist's job is to inform the public. So I try to tell the story straight down and let people conclude. But I'm also mindful of the fact that Eisenhower warned the public against the military-industrial complex and also said that the way to balance that out was the alert and knowledgeable citizenry. And that's why I think it's important, your question which asks about influence. As a whole, I found that all of these scientists that work for DARPA are really amazing scientists working super hard on pushing technology and science in a way, and grateful that DARPA is there to fund them. I found that the problem, and this is my opinion and not my presentation as much, but I found that the problem seemed to lie in that idea of influence. And that's where my own position as a citizen kicks in as opposed to a journalist, which is, you know, that Eisenhower did warn against this idea of unwarranted influence. And it seems that, you know, when he spoke those words in 1961, the military-industrial complex, the defense contractors, were just getting started. And now, of course, they are omnipotent. And I think that the alert and knowledgeable citizenry has a responsibility to pay attention to this. People always say, well, isn't Congress doing anything about this? No, they're not. But, you know, you can just simply by being aware, by knowing that the people that are advising the Pentagon which weapon systems to procure are the people who are creating them.
Because there's certain elements that you cover in your book where there's ideas of how to treat the injured warfighter, whether it is with elements of brain injury, traumatic brain injury, to even limb regeneration, which again seems to be going away from the idea of creating new weapon systems.
Quite the opposite.
But so what's really happening there?
Well, the Limb Regeneration Lab, I mean, that's super interesting. It's this idea that humans can one day, you know, regenerate their own limbs. And when I was interviewing the scientists down at UC Irvine who are working on this program, and I said, because what I try to do is make science simple, you know, really make it understandable. And I said, but just help me out, like make it really simple. I mean, salamanders can regenerate their limbs, humans can't. How does that work? And Dr. Gardner said to me, well, actually, humans can regenerate. We all did. And I kind of looked at him and he said, we all began as one cell, and then we were two, and then we were more. That's regeneration. So we have the capacity to regenerate. And when you look at big science in that way, that these guys are taking big science and going small, I mean, that's big. Those are big ideas. DARPA's funding that. Is that a weapon system? No. That is, you know, helping warfighters who lose limbs or individuals who lose limbs in accidents. But the brain programs are very different because my understanding from interviewing DARPA scientists, the brain programs are presented by DARPA, and many of them are very classified. They're in the clinical trial stage. It's this idea of implanting neural prosthetics into the brain of brain-wounded warriors, so guys who come back from Iraq and Afghanistan with brain injuries, who have cognitive impairment. And this idea that these neural implants will help restore their brain functions. And so that is a noble idea, and DARPA has teamed up with the White House on the Brain Initiative to do this. But what many scientists said to me is there is also something else going on, which is DARPA mapping the brain, and DARPA using this information from the electrodes in the brain to learn about how the neural networks work, so that, and this is the idea, that long-coveted barrier to break artificial intelligence can happen, because DARPA has been at the forefront of artificial intelligence since its inception, and no one has been able to figure out how to make machines think. And the idea is that these brain chip programs are actually will lead the way toward true artificial intelligence, which syncs right up in line with the idea of self-governance in autonomous weapons.
So, with that in mind, let's start at the origins of DARPA. There's really two watershed moments that give rise to DARPA. One is the detonation of the 15 megaton H-bomb, as well as the Sputnik launch, and really the off-the-mark estimation by the U.S. of Soviet aggression and capabilities. Talk to us a little bit more about how DARPA was created and what its original mission was.
Well, I begin the book with this extraordinary explosion, 15 megaton. It was called Castle Bravo bomb. I interviewed 2 scientists who worked on that bomb, who were there, that were witness to that test. And I think from hearing their eyewitness testimony about this explosion, you get the real sense right away of like, these are big weapons. And DARPA was created to defend against the weapon which we had created, American scientists. So it begins with this idea of the military-industrial complex existing and having a built-in obsolescence, that the weapon we created will pretty soon be obsolete and a new weapon system will have to be created. But the real moment that DARPA began was several years later when the Soviets launched Sputnik. And so Sputnik was just a little 23-inch sphere, and we might say, looking back at history, well, what's so threatening about that? But the Soviets had beaten us into space. And not only that, Sputnik was lofted by an ICBM, and the idea was, well, if the Soviets can get Sputnik into space, they can also get a nuclear warhead into space and down onto Washington, D.C. real soon. And so DARPA was created literally in a matter of weeks after the launch of Sputnik to make sure that we, America, were never again taken by technological surprise. And what's interesting, in all these decades since, DARPA has done its job, in essence, because we've never been taken by technological surprise. DARPA has also done its job to create this very powerful, almost omnipotent military-industrial complex that is forever creating new weapon systems once the weapon systems become public and the enemy creates that same weapon system.
That's really a part of an irony of the creation of DARPA and the Eisenhower administration when it was created. And coming out of that administration, his warning to the American public about being concerned about the rise of and the eventual omnipotence of that military-industrial complex. And so just to take us to today really quick, in terms of DARPA and its influence and its mission, but really ultimately, who is making these decisions about our future and our destiny? I mean, in terms of that military-industrial complex.
Well, that was a very interesting part of researching the book, to learn that one of the, DARPA is very quickly into the game realized that there were these major national security problems that needed solving. And so they looked to what DARPA called the supermen of science. And these were the Jason scientists. And anyone here, this doesn't look like much of a conspiracy theory crowd, but anyone who follows conspiracy theories probably knows that the Jason scientists are often considered right up there with the Illuminati in terms of, people see them as these wizards behind the curtain doing all these kind of bad things. When in fact, I interviewed the co-founder of the Jason scientists, a physicist named Marvin Goldberger. And he created the Jasons with a couple fellow physicist colleagues in 1960 and advised the Pentagon for decades. And what I found was that the Jason scientists were remarkably level-headed and detached in their assessments. They wrote a number of reports, many of which Goldberger shared with me, declassified reports, many still are classified. But what was interesting is to get the perspective of Goldberger that went like this, which is that the Jason scientists were all physicists who were academics, so they taught most of the time at America's great universities. And then in the summer, they would gather for what they called summer studies, and they would address these great problems of national defense. And you see over the decades the Jasons advising the DARPA this way, and I write about their role in all the different wars, the Cold War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War. But when you come full circle to where we are now, I learned a very important thing. And it has to do with the fact that the Pentagon is really moving toward autonomous weapons. And people surprisingly aren't really familiar with this. I mean, there's a lot of talk about, wow, what if? When in fact, this is dogma at the Pentagon. And you can read about it in their unclassified reports that talk about DARPA's plans and the Pentagon's plans for drones and autonomous warfare, also called hunter-killer drones, through 2038. And when I was having a discussion with one of the program managers at DARPA about some of these hunter-killer drones, the science of which is being pursued in these very sort of spooky areas that involve brain implants and mapping the brain and charting, neurological behavior in brain-wounded warriors. And I was saying, well, I read a report where the Jason scientists do not think this is a good idea. In fact, they specifically advise the Pentagon against moving in this direction. And the program manager, Michael Goldblatt, said to me, well, Jason's hardly relevant anymore. And I said, what do you mean? This is news to me. And he said, well, it's kind of news at the Pentagon, and it just started happening during the War on Terror, where the Jason scientists are being moved out. And in their place of power has come a group called the Defense Science Board, who has been at the Pentagon for a while, but their position in terms of advising the Pentagon and advising how DARPA will move forward has changed. And here's the rub that concerned me, is that the Defense Science Board is made up of individuals who are full-time defense contractors. They are not part-time defense contractors and full-time academics. They sit on the boards of these major, whether it's Boeing, Lockheed, General Dynamics, etc. And they are the ones who are now really advising DARPA how the government should move toward autonomous warfare, which brings up a very important question. And it brings up what you asked about, which was Eisenhower's concept of the military-industrial complex. So if those who are advising the Pentagon how to proceed and which vast weapon systems of the future to create are the very individuals who are responsible for creating and selling those vast weapon systems of the future, then you have that closed loop that Eisenhower warned against.
Because over the history of DARPA and with the involvement of the Jason scientists, there has been time and again where they have given warning, saying this is not an appropriate use of, say, this technology, whether
Yes.
that was utilizing nuclear warfare on the Ho Chi Minh Trail during Vietnam and perhaps other examples. And with that, it's almost a conscience, and it seems as if there has been this tension, or there is still some tension within the Pentagon, but beyond that, there is the greater need for an informed citizenry. Can you describe a little bit of that tension? Is that tension,
Yes.
is it getting greater, or are we seeing the scales tip in one way or the other?
Well, the tension is really arising from this idea that what the Pentagon believes the best way forward in warfare is, and again, these are unclassified documents. I write about them in the book. I mean, they're available to be read. Some of them are quite long. But it talks about how the Pentagon is moving toward robotic warfare. These are weapons that people know as hunter-killer drones. So whereas now you have a drone that's under remote control, there's an operator somewhere, whether it's Creech Air Force Base or in Washington, D.C., deploying, flying this drone over the war theater, there is a movement that will go toward drones that are self-governing, and that you can essentially, let's say, and this is a bad version, but you show the drone a photograph and say, go assassinate this guy and report back to me. That's an autonomous drone. The intelligence, the capabilities are not there yet, but the Pentagon is very insistent on the pursuit of these technologies. And so you ask about the pushback. Well, I was surprised to learn that much of the pushback is actually coming from inside the Pentagon. So the Pentagon, gave out sort of questionnaires to many people, from the commanding officers to the drone operators, asking what the general feel was about this movement toward autonomous drones. And the general consensus was not a good idea. So instead of taking that into consideration and maybe shifting policy, then Undersecretary of Defense Ashton Carter, who's now the Secretary of Defense, sent out this memo which said, let's create a program where we work on robotics and ethics. And so then that was disseminated among the commanding generals, the drone operators, and everybody in between, to sort of learn that robots could have ethics. And the idea came back, well, no, not at all, because robots don't have morals. And then this is where it got really tricky. So that trail kind of stops, and I was unable to find out what happened next, what the next movement was from the Pentagon. But separately, I noticed that right around this time, Darpa started a new program, and it has to do with trust. And it's called Narrative Networks. It's one of those really innocuous names, the N2 program. And on face value, it's like DARPA's working with storytellers and anthropologists to try to figure out how people, are influenced by narratives. But another element of the Narrative Networks program works very specifically, and I interviewed the scientists on this program, deals with a chemical in the brain called oxytocin. And that is sometimes called the brain's moral molecule. And it is this idea that this is what humans use as a trust mechanism in their brain. So if you trust someone, you emit oxytocin. A breastfeeding mother, for example, this is in DARPA documentation, emits oxytocin. And so DARPA is now having this program looking into the use of oxytocin and how you can manipulate trust. And again, this is speculation, but one can't help but wonder, okay, the guys at the Pentagon don't like the idea toward movement toward autonomous drones. They don't trust drones that have self-government, and let's have a program that manipulates trust. And that's where we get into some of those ideas about, well, what is DARPA really doing? What are their goals, and how are they achieving them?
I mean, it's interesting to see, again, from the evolution of DARPA and its original focus, looking at deterring or at least being able to defeat a nuclear attack, and something that is on a global and a large scale. And over the years, how that has come down, it's really kind of been filtered down and focused down more and more, almost on the individual. And the idea of weapon systems going all the way down into a single warfighter. And how do you augment cognition? How do you make that person who is injured in warfare continue to fight? How do you deal with fatigue? It's beyond just the larger weapon system. It takes us into the evolution, in some ways, of humans.
DARPA calls it transhumanism, military transhumanism. But in an interesting way, this is actually part and parcel of the whole movement towards robotics. It's not only making individual warfighters comfortable with robots, it's this idea of coupling man and machine and merging humans and machine. And DARPA is doing that with programs now with what they call biohybrids, which people might call cyborgs. They are able to actually control a rat through a labyrinth remotely because they've implanted electrodes in its brain. They can do the same with a moth. DARPA in 2014 created a steerable moth by inserting electrodes in the pupa stage of the moth, which then transformed. The wings came out, and this part of the machinery is now part of the animal system. DARPA is able to steer a moth. And when you ask about transhumanism, and as I write in the book, it all began in this very interesting moment decades ago. This is actually not new. It was when the Berlin Wall came down. Many Soviet bioweapons engineers defected to the United States, and DARPA hired them. A quote from a DARPA director at the time was, "We had no biologists in the Pentagon." They were busy having those people like the Jason scientists, supermen of scientists, men dealing with machines, engineers, physicists looking at these big space systems. But suddenly, the idea that biology is important became what was called a thrust at DARPA. And there began this movement to look inside the body, to work with what they call the dismounted soldier, the guy that's walking on the ground. And this led to a whole new umbrella of programs, which is called augmented cognition, which is called, in short, the super soldier program. And it's how to make warfighters smarter than other warfighters, stronger than other warfighters. And again, these, are double-edged swords. Many people who are proponents of transhumanism say, why not control evolution? The cochlear implant, the pacemaker being great examples of, benefiting man by augmenting the physical body. People who are very against transhumanism say there's something really wrong with this. I think the reason that I like writing narrative stories, as I do in my book, is that I tell it from the perspective of the people involved, and maybe you get to decide what you think of transhumanism.
So there are other elements that DARPA has very much been on the forefront of. And so it is getting down to, in some cases, how are we changing or how can we change humans? But then it's also mapping humans, and whether that is with the global war on terror and the evolution of kind of the scientists involved in more of a social science approach to fighting terrorism, to also literally humans becoming data points. And some of the programs born out of DARPA's own visions. Can you talk a little bit about that? And one of the programs, Total Information Awareness,
Yes.
and how that's evolved to what has become a lot of news in recent years.
So here we're in the realm of what DARPA, or the Pentagon, calls ISR. It's intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And it's an idea that actually goes back to the Vietnam War, when DARPA had its first shift, going from these big sort of anti-ballistic missile defense programs to suddenly being sent into the jungles of Vietnam and being asked to create different weapon systems to fight the insurgents, particularly on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And this idea sprang forth of sensor technology. And at the time, it was so rudimentary. It was like guys, and I interview these guys in the book, you know, that are flying in low and slow over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Incredibly dangerous. In one situation, these guys are shot down. And they're rescued in this very dramatic way. Because what they were doing is they're dropping out of the aircraft and helicopters these giant sensors that are like this big. They're kind of shaped like a dart, and they're supposed to literally fly out of the aircraft, land on the ground in a string, and then the electronic information gets relayed up to a helicopter that's flying in a racetrack formation overhead. And then that information gets relayed back to what was called an information center in Thailand, where soldiers are using these new technologies, this is back in 1965, 66, called computers, to try and create algorithms to figure out what these Ho Chi Minh fighters are doing on the trail, where they're headed, what they're going to attack next. I mean, this technology was laughed at the Pentagon, by the way. But of course, this is now exactly what we know as surveillance, as the big surveillance network that you referred to. And we saw this program again in the war on terror when DARPA ran into a lot of trouble publicly when it created a system called the Total Information Awareness program. And that was this idea to use sensor technology to monitor American citizens, to look at their credit card transactions, to look at the library books they take out, to monitor who they're talking to try and create with computers, which are now very sophisticated, and algorithms which have gotten much more sophisticated with help from NSA, etc., to then use this system of systems to find not the Ho Chi Minh fighter on the trail, but rather the terrorist among us. And so you can see how one technology decades later becomes this other incredible DARPA technology. And that is very much what we have now in the surveillance systems that are going on.
So over the course of DARPA's history, there has been, with some of its inventions, with some of its programs, there has been pushback. One was this total information awareness that eventually got splintered off into the NSA and PRISM and a variety of other programs. Can you recount some of the other experiences or the other incidents in the past that DARPA has really had to has had to either sweep under the carpet or in some ways fix its public image?
Its image, yes. I mean, after the Vietnam War, an interesting thing happened. You know, there's this perception that there was it wasn't a perception, it was a reality that there was a downsizing of the military per se, which there was. DARPA got in big trouble for doing what was called pre-requirement research, for creating weapon systems that were ahead of the time when in fact we needed to be, you know, fighting this war in Vietnam that we lost. And so DARPA was punished. It got kicked out of the Pentagon, that sort of coveted place to be, and sent several miles away, where it is now in Arlington, Virginia. They had a couple moves. But so DARPA kind of got its wrist slapped, and there was a moment with many of the people who were there at the time talking about how, you know, they thought maybe the agency would be folded, but that's not what happened. In fact, the opposite happened, which is that suddenly DARPA got an influx of money thanks to the Secretary of Defense, Harold Brown, who was the first scientist in the Pentagon to be Secretary of Defense. Brown had been in charge of all the DARPA technology during the Vietnam War, specifically the sensor technology. And Brown created an entire industry behind this idea of information technology, behind the idea of nanotechnology, which is the art of making things small, that all of these sensor systems could be shrunken down. And so even though the public perception was that DARPA was in trouble, DARPA had created Agent Orange during the war. So there was a real idea of banishment, and yet, in fact, the agency flourished. And it didn't really become evident until the Gulf War, when we had a Secretary of Defense, then Dick Cheney, who was a real proponent of using technology to win. And the Gulf War was that incredible show of power, network-centric warfare, that displayed what DARPA was capable of and what you could do to an enemy force if you had technological superiority. But that only worked in that very specific environment, and it certainly didn't work the next war on the horizon, the war on terror, which dealt with urban warfare.
So with these directions that DARPA has taken, and some of there's been trajectories over decades. Again, going back to another example out of the Vietnam War was the idea of trying to apply behavioral science or some social science to understand, or seemingly to try to understand the Viet Cong and what was motivating, what was driving them. But in some cases, it's taken the Pentagon years to appreciate what DARPA has concluded or what they suggested. What happened in that case with the Viet Cong?
Well, I was really surprised, like you're referring to learn that there were anthropologists hired by DARPA in the war, and that came, and again, there's a parallel here with the Iraq War, so I think it's very interesting to consider, because the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, at the time, was stuck on this question. He actually had the equivalent, the 1960s version of a Post-it note in his office that said, what made the Vietnam tick? He wanted to know why these Viet Cong fighters were siding with the communists and not siding with the Americans. And so DARPA set about this sprawling program where it hired anthropologists and social scientists to go into the field, to conduct interviews, to try and find out what made the Viet Cong tick. And you know, I write at length, and I interviewed the lead on that, a man named Joseph Zasloff, and part of why he felt what he told me was so important, because this was a colossal failure. I mean, the Hearts and Minds campaign failed. And Zasloff said that he felt that, you know, when he saw this same thing going on in the Iraq War, because, again, DARPA got this idea, almost like it had amnesia, that DARPA had done this during the Vietnam War, got this brilliant idea during the War on Terror, hey, let's start a Hearts and Minds campaign and figure out what makes the Iraqis tick. And it was the same story over again, and that same failure. So the idea is DARPA is investing all this time and treasure, and one would hope that one would at least get experience and be able to say, well, this doesn't work, how do we need to adjust? And instead, it's astonishing to see that same, you know, instead of amnesia, instead of experience, you get amnesia. And it was no louder spoken to me when I read the Army issued a statement when it kicked this program into effect in Iraq. It was called the Human Terrain Program. And on their website, the Army wrote, this is the first time in history that anthropologists and social scientists are being sent into the war theater on a large scale. But no, it wasn't.
With the shift in influence, and it's interesting talking about trying to find the trust molecule. With the evolution of the influence of DARPA and who is influencing DARPA, is this an agency that the American public can trust? On one hand, we've gotten this narrative from DARPA again and again about what it has essentially given the world. Again, the example of the internet or GPS to make sure that we're not getting lost on our way to tonight's talk. Is with those beneficial those benefits aside, is this an agency you feel like that we can trust?
You know, the journalist's job is to inform the public, so I try to tell the story straight down and let people conclude. But I'm also mindful of the fact that Eisenhower warned the public against the military-industrial complex, and also said that the way to balance that out was the alert and knowledgeable citizenry. And that's why I think it's important, your question which asks about influence. As a whole, I found that all of these scientists that work for DARPA are really amazing scientists working super hard on pushing technology and science in a way, and grateful that DARPA is there to fund them. I found that the problem, and this is my opinion and not my presentation as much, but I found that the problem seemed to lie in that idea of influence. And that's where my own position as a citizen kicks in as opposed to a journalist, which is, you know, that Eisenhower did warn against this idea of unwarranted influence. And it seems that, you know, when he spoke those words in 1961, the military-industrial complex, the defense contractors, were just getting started. And now, of course, they are omnipotent. And I think that the alert and knowledgeable citizenry has a responsibility to pay attention to this. People always say, well, isn't Congress doing anything about this? No, they're not. But, you know, you can just simply by being aware, by knowing that the people that are advising the Pentagon which weapon systems to procure are the people who are creating them.
And they want to present this in a certain way. And what had happened is that the Chinese expression, the signal, which I've mispronounced badly, actually means...
you can pronounce it at all.
Well, you haven't tried it.
I wouldn't even try. I just butcher everything.
Yeah, well, let's do that too. HSINAO, signal, means the cleansing of the heart, and it's not a term that's original to the Chinese communists. It's a term that's been around for 1,000 years at least, and it's a practice within the religion of Taoism. That the idea is that you are awakening yourself to compassion and this sort of thing. And now,
now that is fascinating. There is so much to unpack in just what you just said, because of the techniques that were developed to use that. Yes. And it's funny because you mentioned cleanse. It's translated as cleansing the heart, because I have read earlier that it was cleansing the brain, and that's where they came up with the term brainwashing. But perhaps that was...
Oh, that's another confusion. The Chinese traditionally believe that thought takes place in the heart.
Ah, okay.
And so the organ was moved.
Okay, so then you could sort of, from one point of view, legitimately translate it as cleansing the brain if you're thinking that that's the center of your thinking process, yeah. Whereas we think of the heart as the center of feeling and emotion. Yeah. And it's a bit of a cultural divide there.
Yeah, neither concept is exactly true. But,
right.
But yeah, it's a spiritual practice.
Interesting. Does that... I'm going to interrupt you as we go. I'm just going to ask you.
Absolutely.
Does that term, the cleansing of the heart or the cleansing of the thought processes or whatever, is that the term they used in the re-education camps?
Well, generally they use the term that's translated as thought struggle, and this is an essential aspect of the process. What was actually happening in the camps is that they were taking people and saying, well, look, you have to believe thoroughly in our Chinese way.
Yes.
Level 42. You have to, and what I see, I've spent a lifetime, one of my side interests is Chinese philosophy, so I've made my own gradual translation of the Lao Tzu, which was always more important to me than Ron Hubbard. I think it's one of the things that saved me, that I figured this guy Lao Tzu knew it better than Hubbard did. No, but himself.
He might have had a few good things to say. I don't know. I've heard a few good things about it.
It's true. Hubbard talks about Lao Tzu in the Phoenix Lectures.
Yes, he does.
You can tell from his spelling, he spells the name of the book Tao de King with a K, and the only other person who does that's Aleister Crowley. Contemporary spelling is with
Hubbard,
a K.
Your influences are showing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where he got his ideas from. But so they would have this concept of thought struggle, and the idea is that you would, and it's still an aspect of Maoist communism, wherever you find it, that you have to get into this process of self-criticism, and you have to publicly confess and denounce yourself.
Yes.
That's where the thought reform process that Lifton described so accurately, that's where it comes from. And it's a switchover. The Confucius, in about 500 BC, lays down the analects and this way of living a life, which will dominate China from then on. I mean, he went to his grave with, I think, only 5 disciples, thinking he'd failed completely. And to this day, much of Asia is run on Confucian principles. Here's a strange comparison that Leo Strauss, the guy who, neocon, from University of Chicago, who trained Dick Cheney and various other people, he pretty much puts forward a Confucian idea that you have to get the people to believe in a set of rules. And he says it as Confucius did. It doesn't really matter if what they believe in is not true.
Well, and that is factual.
Yeah.
And Hubbard even got into that when he talked about the confusion and the stable datum principle.
And when he talks about reality being an agreement, he's talking about this thing that it doesn't matter what the truth is, you can make reality out of agreement. So
that's right.
Confucius, it would appear, is one of many atheists who founded religions. Lao Tzu, Jiangsu, and the Buddha were all atheists, and they all ended up founding religions, which I don't think they meant to do, really. But we have to be very careful, Chris, what we say to people and what we do. It doesn't matter anyway, because somebody will come along and cherry pick.
Yeah, exactly. History's not kind to originality. It craves change and modification and that sort of thing as people. It's the historical telephone game.
Yeah, it's a Mississippi of lies, as Voltaire said. So the heart of the Confucian system is the family, much more so than in any other religion or system I know of. The family is paramount. And what Mao Zedong set out to do was to transfer your allegiance from the family to the Communist Party. And that's the foundation of the whole thought reform brainwashing process. And my other problem with it is that, of course, it was a program of physical coercion. You were locked in a cell, you were shackled, you could be starved, you could be beaten. And so if you want to talk about classical brainwashing, that's what it means. Well, things like that have happened in the dangerous cult groups, such as Scientology, let's mention that name there. That people who were put on the RPF as RPF, the Rehabilitation Project Force's own
Rehabilitation Project Force, yeah.
They could be chained down, they could be locked in cells, but the process, I think it's dangerous to associate that very forceful process of brainwashing with the far more subtle social compliance programs and amplification of behavior that happen inside groups like the Moonies or Scientology. Though, of course, with the Moonies, you have this bizarre thing that Sun Myung Moon was actually trained in these processes and ran a group called Victory Over Communism in the early 50s before deciding he was, Jesus had failed and he was the real Messiah, which proves wrong.
That is absolutely no surprise. I'm just going to say right now, it's zero surprise at all. I remember, in fact, Steve Hassan discussing the Korean influence you know, and I at the time I didn't really totally duplicate or understand the background on that. And now that I've studied some more about North Korea and its own history, it makes complete sense. And I just wanted to also comment on that father figure thing, because that's really, really important with the in China, with the government leaders, you know, taking the place of the father figure, and also that concept directly was taken up by the Kim family in North Korea, because that is their entire philosophy, is that the head of state is the father of the country.
Yeah, and Sun Myung Moon called himself True Father.
Yes.
True Father.
Yes.
And, you know, and again, it's a side route that people go down, the idea that the head of the cult is a father figure, and that that gives some kind of explanation that we wanted to submit to some parental authority. I've always felt very hesitant about that, because I never had that sort of relationship with Hubbard. He seemed to me fallible and human. And while I didn't particularly question his, you know, I was a devoted believer, I was quite willing to make jokes about him, and you know, and regard him as human. And it's only really on leaving, you know, I mean, the joking and degrading, this thing that it was wrong to say anything about Hubbard, that sort of came along. I'd been involved for about 6 years, I think, by the time that came out, 5 or 6 years, and I just disregarded it. It just seemed a bizarre thing to do. But there is some truth. People make an attachment to the leader, and as our friend Yuval Laor says, they not only treat the cult leader as a parental figure, they treat the cult as a baby. They treat the cult as their child. So in the same way that you won't, you know, brook any sort of criticism of the ugliness of your little baby, then the cult is, the group is protected in the same way, that you're not allowed to think anything negative about it. And that's self-imposed. It's not because of, it's just a kind of normal relationship. So we do, you know, take authority from above, and then, you know, make sure that we're defending the poor little defenseless cult from any criticism or censure, which of course is where critical thinking becomes kind of vital. This, you know, I realized, I was talking with a friend last year, and we were talking about cognitive dissonance, you know, the kind of wobbly feeling you have when your views are questioned, which is really the foundation of much of our understanding. Leon Festinger's work, Steve Hassan's bite model, for example, behavior, information, thought and emotion control, is a development out of Leon Festinger's work in cognitive dissonance. And I thought about it, and you know, I realized that I actually rather like it when people disagree with me. And this isn't psychological masochism, I promise you. I don't like it when they're rude to me, you know, and that, you know, and I'll be rude back to them probably, because I'm not that good a person really. But when somebody comes along to me and says, no, I think you're wrong about that, for me, it's an invitation, not to an argument, but to a discussion, to a conversation, where I will find something out. Now, you know, John Stuart Mill, the wonderful On Liberty by John Stuart Mill, which is a text all children should read by the age of 7, I think. Maybe a little older than that. But
maybe a little bit older, yeah.
I read it when I was about 57, actually. But
right.
I finally got to it. But what an incredible statement. There's this guy saying, you've got to keep listening to the same idiots talking the same rubbish just to make sure that you're right. You know, you've got to keep always testing the boundaries to see if you're right. And what will happen is you have a conversation, and hopefully in a conversation, a discussion, all of the people involved will come away with something. And that's quite a good segue back into the Radicalisation Awareness Network. But there are these discussions, and people are then going back to their practice to apply something. And I think that because in the counter-cult world, because of you know, Steve Hassan, Jolly West, we can talk about Jolly in a minute if you like. I mentioned him on a podcast the other week and said that he was a friend of mine. And there was this, he worked for the CIA sort of stuff that sort of blew up. And it was like, well, I don't know. He was from 1951 onwards, he was criticizing Ron Hubbard. That's the first time he published about Hubbard. And he spent a lifetime being very public, criticizing methods of thought reform and mind control. So I don't think he was actually involved with their programs. I do think he was asked questions about them, and I do think he made negative comments and said, you know, this is a very evil thing to do and you shouldn't be doing it. So he was talking to those people. But John Clark and Margaret Singer, they brought what they were finding in the field of social psychology. Margaret Singer working with Shine on returning POWs from Korea. And she was very early on in the 60s, she was sort of saying, well, it's strange because these POWs are suffering something that's very like what battered wives suffer. You know, this kind of the anxiety, what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress. So she was one of the first to say, I get this thing, I bet you do too, where people are like, well, you know, the group I belong to is different from these other groups. And you've got 3,000 different groups and they're all really different. You go, yes, and they're all composed of human beings, but really similar. I'm sort of proposing something, and I want to work on this, that one of the problems is that with Prevent, say in the UK, that they've gone into schools and they've taught people about terrorism, which is a very good thing to be doing. But unfortunately, it's left this taste that maybe it's Muslims that are doing this. And so we're seeing a rise in Islamophobia because the kids aren't understanding that this is a completely aberrant form of Islam, that when you look to the Salafi ideas that have Wahhabism that have come out of Saudi Arabia and been promoted with the oil money all over the world, that there's a subset within the Wahhabis that turned into Al-Qaeda and all of this sort of thing. Now, the Salafis make up about 0.5% of all Muslims, and then a subset within them. So,
and it's really hard in schools to explain nuance to 7, 8, 9, 10, even 12-year-olds. These very complicated matters, and these groups are gigantic groups with lots of different subgroups and units, and you know, and the groups, and this is hard to get across to adults in America.